On April 6, 1898, 3 days after the 16th anniversary of Jesse James's death, Thomas Garrett walked into the Liberty Bank of Missouri and calmly announced to the teller that he was there to collect what Jesse left behind. The 16-year-old farm boy had never been inside a bank before, yet he knew the exact layout of the building, the location of the safe, and most disturbing of all, the daily routines of every employee. When bank president William Hayes asked how the boy could possibly know such details, Thomas looked him straight in the eye and said, "Because I am Jesse Woodson James, and this is my town." What happened next would terrorize Clay County for 3 years and create a legend that locals still debate more than 2 decades later. Before we continue with the chilling story of Thomas Garrett and his impossible transformation into Missouri's most feared outlaw, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear for more dark tales from America's hidden past. Hit that notification bell and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts across the nation. The young man who claimed to be Jesse James would go on to recreate the outlaw's most notorious crimes with terrifying accuracy, leading a gang of desperate men through a series of robberies that perfectly mirrored the original Jesse's methods. By the time the authorities finally cornered him, Thomas Garrett had become something far more dangerous than a simple bank robber. He had become the living ghost of America's most legendary criminal. Thomas Garrett was born on April 6, 1882, in a modest farmhouse just outside Kearney, Missouri, exactly 3 days after Robert Ford shot Jesse James in the back at his home in St. Joseph. The timing was remarkable enough to draw comment from a midwife who delivered him, Sarah Mitchell, an elderly woman who had lived in Clay County for over 40 years and remembered the James boys from their childhood. The Garrett family had no connection to Jesse James or his gang. Thomas's father, Robert Garrett, was a hard-working farmer who had spent the Civil War years trying to keep his family fed rather than fighting for either side. His mother, Elizabeth, came from a respectable Methodist family in Independence and had never shown interest in the outlaw legends that fascinated so many Missouri residents. They were, by all accounts, decent, law-abiding people who raised their children to respect authority and work hard for honest wages. For the first 12 years of his life, Thomas appeared to be following in his parents' footsteps. He attended the one-room schoolhouse in Kearney 3 days a week, helped with farm chores, and showed no unusual interest in guns, horses, or the criminal exploits that had made Clay County famous throughout the nation. His teacher, Martha Hopkins, remembered him as a quiet but intelligent boy who read voraciously and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and geography. The transformation began subtly during the summer of 1894, when Thomas turned 12. His parents first noticed his newfound fascination with maps, particularly detailed surveys of Missouri's railroad lines and river crossings. He would spend hours studying these documents, tracing routes with his finger, and making notes in the margins that his parents couldn't understand. When asked about his interest, Thomas would simply say he was planning for the future. Around the same time, Thomas began demonstrating an unusual knowledge of firearms that his parents couldn't explain. Despite never having been taught to shoot, he could field strip and reassemble a Colt revolver with the speed and precision of an experienced gunman. When his father questioned him about these skills, Thomas claimed he had learned by watching other men. But Robert Garrett knew that his son had rarely left their farm and had never spent time around anyone with such expertise. More disturbing was Thomas's growing obsession with horses and riding techniques. The Garrett family owned 2 draft horses used for farm work, but Thomas began training himself in the kind of advanced horsemanship that only came from years of practice or natural talent that bordered on the supernatural. He could mount a moving horse, ride bareback at full gallop, and execute complex maneuvers that impressed even the most experienced riders in Clay County. By his 14th birthday, Thomas had also developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Clay County geography that went far beyond what any local resident should possess. He knew every creek bed, every cave system, every abandoned building, and most importantly, every escape route that could be used to evade pursuit by law enforcement. When neighbors commented on his unusual familiarity with the area, Thomas would smile and say he had always been good at finding his way around places he'd never been before. The most unsettling change in Thomas's behavior was his growing interest in the Jesse James legend. He began collecting newspaper clippings about the outlaw, studying photographs of gang members, and asking detailed questions about crimes that had occurred before his birth. His parents initially dismissed this fascination as typical adolescent interest in notorious figures. But Thomas's knowledge went far, beyond what could be learned from published accounts. The first clear indication that Thomas Garrett was becoming something more dangerous than a curious teenager came on a cold February evening in 1896, 2 months before his 14th birthday. Robert Garrett was returning from town after dark when he spotted a group of riders moving through the woods behind his property. Concerned about horse thieves, he grabbed his shotgun and went to investigate. What he found was his son Thomas leading 3 older men through the forest with the confidence and authority of an experienced commander. The men, whom Robert recognized as drifters and troublemakers from the surrounding counties, were following Thomas's directions without question, as he guided them through terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate in daylight, much less during a moonless night. When Robert confronted the group, Thomas calmly explained that he was showing the men some old hiding places that might be useful someday. The casual way he spoke about concealment and the obvious respect the older men showed for his knowledge sent a chill through Robert's heart. This wasn't the behavior of a farm boy exploring his property. It was the conduct of someone planning for activities that would require hiding from the law. The 3 men Thomas had been leading were Samuel Hayes, a former Confederate soldier who had turned to cattle rustling after the war; William Porter, a drifter with a reputation for violence, who had been run out of several Missouri towns; and, most troubling of all, Frank Wheeler, a man in his 40s who had once ridden with the younger brothers and claimed to have known Jesse James personally. When Robert demanded that the men leave his property immediately, Thomas's demeanor changed in a way that genuinely frightened his father. The boy's voice took on a tone of cold authority as he told the men they could go, but that he would send word when it was time to get serious about business. The casual confidence with which he dismissed grown men who had shown no inclination to respect Robert's authority made it clear that Thomas commanded a loyalty that went far beyond his age or apparent experience. Over the following months, Robert noticed that his son was frequently absent from the farm for hours at a time, always claiming to be hunting or exploring, but never bringing home game or showing any evidence of typical adolescent activities. More disturbing were the visitors who began appearing at the Garrett farm, rough men who would speak briefly with Thomas before riding away without introducing themselves or explaining their business. Elizabeth Garrett became increasingly worried about her son's behavior and the type of men he was associating with. She noticed that Thomas had acquired items that the family had never purchased: expensive boots, a high-quality saddle, and most alarming of all, a pair of Colt revolvers that he kept hidden in the barn, but which she had seen him practicing with when he thought no one was watching. When confronted about these possessions, Thomas claimed they were gifts from friends who appreciated his help with various projects. His parents' attempts to learn more about these mysterious benefactors were met with evasive answers and increasingly thinly veiled threats about the consequences of interfering with important business. The situation came to a head in the autumn of 1896 when Robert Garrett discovered that someone had been storing supplies in their barn: boxes of ammunition, bags of flour and beans, blankets, and other items that suggested preparation for extended periods away from civilization. When he confronted Thomas about these discoveries, his son's response was both chilling and illuminating. "Papa," Thomas said with the calm certainty of someone much older than 14, "there are things happening in this county that you don't understand. Important things that require careful planning and the right kind of men. I've been chosen to lead something that's Bigger than this farm, bigger than this family, and bigger than anything you can imagine. You can either support me or stay out of my way. But you cannot stop what's already begun. The moment that transformed Thomas Garrett from a disturbing teenager into a local legend occurred on April 3rd, 1898, the 16th anniversary of Jesse James' death. Thomas, now 16 years old and standing nearly 6 feet tall with the lean, dangerous look of a seasoned gunfighter, called together the men who had been gathering around him for the past 2 years. The meeting took place in the abandoned barn about 5 miles from the Garrett farm, a location that Thomas had selected because it offered multiple escape routes and couldn't be approached without being seen from a considerable distance. The men who answered his summons represented a cross-section of Missouri's criminal element, former Confederate soldiers who had never adjusted to PCM, drifters and outlaws seeking leadership and purpose, and local men driven to desperation by economic hardship. Samuel Hayes, now completely devoted to Thomas, despite the boy's age, later told authorities that the gathering felt more like a religious revival than a criminal conspiracy. Thomas stood before the assembled men with a presence and authority that seemed impossible for someone so young, but which commanded absolute attention from men who had never shown respect for anyone. "Gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the barn, despite the wind howling outside. "You have followed me for 2 years because you recognized something in me that you couldn't name. Tonight, I'm going to tell you exactly what that something is, and I'm going to give you the chance to be part of something that will make us all legends." He paused, letting his gaze move across each face in the flickering lamplight before continuing. "My name is not Thomas Garrett. That was just the name given to the body I was born into 16 years ago. My real name is Jesse Woodson James, and I have returned to finish what was interrupted by Bob Ford's cowardly bullet on April 3rd, 1882. The reaction among the men was immediate and varied. Some laughed, thinking they were witnessing an elaborate joke or the fantasy of a disturbed teenager. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they were dealing with mental illness or something more dangerous. But Frank Wheeler, the man who claimed to have known the original Jesse James, stared at Thomas with growing amazement and what could only be described as fear. "Prove it," Wheeler said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "If you're really Jesse James, prove it," in a way that only he could. Thomas smiled with the confidence of someone who had been expecting exactly this challenge. From his coat, he withdrew a detailed map of the Liberty Bank that showed not only the building's layout, but also information about the daily routines of employees, the location of the safe, the timing of money deliveries, and most remarkably, a series of notes written in Jesse James's distinctive handwriting that outlined a robbery plan that had never been executed. This is a plan Jesse was working on when Bob Ford shot him, Thomas explained, spreading the map on a wooden crate so all the men could see it. He spent months studying this bank, learning every detail, preparing for what he intended to be his masterpiece. The plan was hidden where only Jesse would think to look for it, and it's been waiting 16 years for the right person to carry it out. Frank Wheeler examined the map with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that could have life or death implications. After several minutes, he looked up at Thomas with an expression of stunned recognition. "This is Jesse's handwriting," he said slowly. "I've seen it before, and I know how he planned jobs. This is exactly how his mind worked, down to the smallest detail." But Thomas wasn't finished with his proof. Over the next hour, he demonstrated knowledge about Jesse, James' criminal methods, personal habits, and private conversations that went far beyond what could have been learned from newspaper accounts, or even from talking to surviving gang members. He knew about arguments between Jesse and Frank James that had never been made public, about hidden supply caches that had never been discovered, and most convincingly about the psychological pressures that had driven Jesse to increasingly desperate crimes during his final years. More disturbing than his knowledge was Thomas's behavior during this meeting. His manner of speaking, his gestures, even his way of moving around the barn perfectly matched descriptions of Jesse James that had been recorded by witnesses to his crimes. It was as if the 16-year-old farm boy had completely disappeared, replaced by someone with decades of criminal experience and the cold calculation of a professional outlaw. "I know what some of you are thinking," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the hard edge that witnesses had described in Jesse's final years. "You're wondering how a boy who wasn't even born when Jesse died could know these things. The answer is simple. I am Jesse James, returned to complete what was interrupted 16 years ago. The body is different, but the mind, the soul, the purpose, these are unchanged." By the end of that night, Thomas had convinced 8 men to join what he called the New James Gang. These weren't impressionable young men seeking adventure. They were hardened criminals and desperate individuals who had seen enough of the world to recognize genuine leadership when they encountered it. The fact that such men were willing to follow a 16-year-old boy suggested either remarkable charisma or something far more unsettling. 3 days after his declaration to the assembled gang, Thomas Garrett walked into the Liberty Bank with the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for 16 years. It was exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, the precise time when the bank would have the most cash on hand, but the fewest customers, just as his mysterious plan had indicated. The robbery itself was a masterpiece of timing and execution that demonstrated knowledge of criminal techniques far beyond what any 16-year-old should possess. Thomas entered the bank alone, approached teller Margaret Sullivan with a friendly smile, and politely asked to speak with Bank President William Hayes about a business matter involving some old debts. When Hayes emerged from his office, Thomas's demeanor changed completely. His voice dropped to the cold, commanding tone that witnesses would later describe as unnaturally mature and absolutely terrifying coming from someone so young. He informed Hayes that he was there to collect money that had been borrowed from Jesse James years earlier and that the debt had now come due with interest. The most unsettling aspect of the robbery was Thomas's intimate knowledge of the bank's operations. He knew which employees were likely to cooperate and which might cause trouble. He directed Hayes to the safe, using information that only someone with access to the bank's most confidential records should have possessed. Most remarkably, he seemed to anticipate every move the bank employees made, as if he had witnessed this exact scene before. "Mr. Hayes," Thomas said, with chilling calm, "you're thinking about the alarm button under your desk. I want you to know that if you reach for it, 3 things will happen. First, my associates outside will assume you betrayed our agreement and will react accordingly. Second, the sheriff will arrive to find a situation far worse than a simple robbery. Third, you will discover that some debts can only be paid in blood rather than money." Hayes later told investigators that the boy's eyes during these threats seemed to belong to someone much older, someone who had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. Despite Thomas's youth, the bank president found himself completely convinced that resistance would result in violence that would make the robbery seem trivial by comparison. Thomas extracted exactly $1,247 from the bank's safe, the precise amount that Jesse James had stolen in his first Liberty Bank robbery 28 years earlier. But more disturbing than the theft was his behavior during the crime. He moved through the bank with the practiced efficiency of an experienced criminal, never wasting motion or time, always positioning himself to maintain control of the situation. As he prepared to leave, Thomas made an announcement that would haunt Clay County for months to come. "This is just the beginning," he told the assembled bank employees and customers. "Jesse James has returned to reclaim what was stolen from him by cowards and traitors. The debt that was owed 16 years ago has been growing with interest, and it will be collected in full before I'm finished." The escape was as perfectly executed as the robbery itself. Thomas walked calmly out of the bank, mounted a horse held by Samuel Hayes, and disappeared into the Missouri countryside using routes that seemed to have been planned decades in advance. When the sheriff's party attempted pursuit, they found themselves following trails that led to carefully prepared ambush points where the gang could have slaughtered the lawmen if they had chosen to do so. Most remarkably, witnesses to the robbery agreed on details that made the crime seem like something from Missouri's violent past, rather than a contemporary criminal act. Thomas's manner of speech, his choice of weapons, even his style of dress perfectly matched historical descriptions of Jesse James during his prime. Bank teller Margaret Sullivan, who had never seen a photograph of the original outlaw, provided a description of Thomas during the robbery that could have been taken from wanted posters issued 20 years earlier. The robbery sent shock waves through Clay County, not just because of its audacious nature, but because of the unsettling possibility it raised in many people's minds. Sheriff Coleman Bradley, who had been a young deputy during the original James gang's reign of terror, privately admitted to close associates that the similarities between Thomas's methods and Jesse's were too precise to be coincidental. Just when we thought the story of Thomas Garrett and his transformation into Jesse James had reached its most disturbing point, his next crime would prove that this was only the beginning of a campaign of terror that would perfectly recreate the most notorious criminal career in American history. If you're finding this tale as chilling as we are, take a moment to share this video with someone who appreciates dark mysteries from our nation's past. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories that blur the line between history and nightmare. What Thomas would do next would convince even the most skeptical observers that something impossible was happening in Missouri, something that defied rational explanation and forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of identity, memory, and the possibility that some individuals are capable of transcending death itself. Following the success of the Liberty Bank robbery, Thomas Garrett began demonstrating criminal expertise that seemed to grow more sophisticated with each passing day. Within 2 weeks of the first heist, he had organized his gang into a disciplined military unit that operated with the precision and coordination of professional soldiers rather than desperate outlaws. The second robbery, conducted at the Citizens Bank in Richmond, Missouri on April 24th, 1898, showcased Thomas's evolution from talented amateur to criminal mastermind. The job required crossing 3 counties, coordinating the movements of 12 men, and executing a complex plan that involved multiple diversions, precise timing, and escape routes that demonstrated intimate knowledge of terrain that Thomas should never have seen before. What made this robbery particularly unsettling was Thomas's apparent ability to predict law enforcement responses with uncanny accuracy. He positioned his men to intercept the telegraph messages that would alert surrounding counties about the crime, planned the timing to avoid scheduled patrol routes, and selected an escape path that took advantage of flooding that had occurred in the area 15 years earlier. Geographical changes that had never been officially mapped. Sheriff Bradley, now convinced that he was dealing with something far more dangerous than juvenile delinquency, began collecting testimony from witnesses to Thomas's crimes. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. A teenager who moved and spoke like a man with decades of criminal experience, who commanded the absolute loyalty of hardened outlaws, and who seemed to possess knowledge about criminal techniques that had never been written down or shared outside of Jesse James' inner circle. Bank President Charles Morrison, who had been forced to open his safe during the Richmond robbery, provided perhaps the most unsettling testimony about Thomas's behavior during the crime. The boy knew things about our security procedures that only someone with inside information should have possessed, Morrison told investigators. But more than that, he moved through our bank like he had been there before, like he was following a mental map that had been drawn years ago. The most disturbing detail of Morrison's account was Thomas's behavior toward customers who were present during the robbery, rather than simply threatening them into compliance. Thomas had addressed several by name, mentioning personal details about their families and businesses that a 16-year-old farm boy from Clay County should never have known. Mrs. Helen, Patterson, whose husband had been killed during one of the original Jesse James robberies 20 years later, claimed that Thomas had spoken to her about her husband's death with details that only the killer could have known. He looked me in the eye and said he was sorry about what happened to Edward. Mrs. Patterson testified through tears. He said it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that Edward had been brave and deserved better. Then he told me things about that day, about what Edward said before he died, that were never in the newspapers and that I had never told anyone. How could a boy who wasn't even born when my husband was killed know such things? As spring turned to summer, in 1898, Thomas's gang expanded from 8 members to nearly 20, attracting desperate men from across the Midwest who were drawn by stories of the young outlaw's success and his uncanny ability to avoid capture. But what made these men stay wasn't just the promise of easy money. It was Thomas's leadership style, which perfectly matched historical accounts of Jesse James's ability to inspire fanatical loyalty among his followers. Frank Wheeler, who had become Thomas's unofficial second-in-command, provided authorities with insights into the gang's internal dynamics that were deeply troubling. According to Wheeler, Thomas didn't just plan and execute robberies. He had recreated the entire culture and methodology of the original. James ganged down to details that had never been made public. He knows things about how Jesse ran his operations that were never written down anywhere. Wheeler explained during his eventual confession to authorities the way he talks to men, the way he plans jobs, even the way he sits on his horse. It's all exactly like Jesse used to do it. I rode with the real Jesse James for 2 years, and I'm telling you that this boy is either Jesse come back from the dead, or he somehow learned things that died with Jesse in 1882. The gang's third major robbery conducted at the Bank of Lexington on July 12, 1898 demonstrated Thomas's growing confidence in his willingness to take risks that bordered on the suicidal. Rather than hitting a small-town bank with minimal security, he chose to rob the largest financial institution between Kansas City and St. Louis during the middle of the day when the building would be crowded with customers and employees. The job required splitting his gang into 3 groups, coordinating their movements across a busy downtown area, and executing a plan that allowed for dozens of variables. That could have gone wrong at any moment. The fact that Thomas pulled it off without a single casualty or significant complication suggested either incredible luck or the kind of experience that only came from years of professional criminal activity. But what truly terrified witnesses to the Lexington robbery was Thomas's behavior during the crime itself. Rather than the nervous energy typical of young criminals, he displayed the cold professionalism of someone who had done this many times before. Bank teller William Foster, who had worked in financial institutions for over 20 years, later described Thomas's demeanor as unnaturally calm, like someone was following a script he had memorized perfectly. As 1898 progressed into autumn, people who had known Thomas Garrett since childhood began reporting changes in his behavior that went far beyond simple criminal activity. His manner of speaking had evolved to match historical accounts of Jesse James's distinctive vocal patterns, including specific pronunciations and phrases that were characteristic of Missouri in the 1860s rather than the 1890s. Dr. Samuel Harrison, who had treated Thomas for a broken arm when the boy was 10 years old, encountered him by chance in Liberty during September 1898 and was shocked by the transformation. It wasn't just that he had grown taller or stronger. Dr. Harrison later testified his entire personality had changed. The quiet, respectful boy I had known was gone, replaced by someone who carried himself like a man who had killed people and expected to kill more. When he looked at me, it was with the eyes of someone much older, someone who had seen things that number 16-year-old should have experienced. More unsettling were reports from Thomas's family about changes in his behavior at home. Elizabeth Garrett, who had been trying desperately to maintain some connection with her son despite his criminal activities, noticed that Thomas had begun speaking about events from the 1860s and 1870s as if he had personal memories of them. He would make casual references to battles from the Civil War, describe people who had died before his birth as if he had known them personally, and demonstrate knowledge about historical events that went far beyond what could be learned from books. He started talking about the war like he had been there. Elizabeth told her pastor, Reverend Samuel Mitchell, during one of many conversations about her son's troubling transformation, not like someone who had read about it or heard stories, but like someone who remembered the smell of gunpowder and the sound of dying men. He would describe battles in detail, talk about commanders by their first names, and sometimes he would just stare off into the distance like he was seeing ghosts that only he could perceive. Robert Garrett's attempts to confront his son about these changes led to conversations that convinced him he was no longer dealing with a child he had raised. During one particularly disturbing encounter in October 1898, Thomas had responded to his father's pleas to abandon his criminal career with a lecture about the economic and political forces that had shaped Missouri during Reconstruction, topics that required sophisticated understanding of history, economics, and politics that far exceeded Thomas's formal education. "Papa, you don't understand what this is really about," Thomas had said with the patient tone of someone explaining complex matters to a child. "This isn't just about robbing banks or proving something to myself. This is about finishing something that was started 30 years ago, something that was interrupted by cowardice and betrayal. There are debts that have to be paid, scores that have to be settled, and justice that has been delayed for far too long." When Robert asked his son to explain what he meant by these cryptic references, Thomas's response was both enlightening and terrifying. He described in detail the economic devastation that had followed the Civil War, the corruption of Reconstruction, politics, and the personal vendettas that had driven the original Jesse James to his criminal career. But more than just reciting historical facts, Thomas spoke about these events with the emotional intensity of someone who had lived through them and been personally affected by their consequences. Perhaps most disturbing was Thomas's evolving relationship with violence. Witnesses to his early robberies had noted his reluctance to use unnecessary force and his apparent concern for the safety of innocent bystanders. But as 1898 wore on, Thomas began displaying a casual attitude toward brutality that matched historical accounts of Jesse James' psychological deterioration during his final years. The change became apparent during the gang's fourth major robbery conducted at the First National Bank of Warrenburg on November 3rd, 1898, when bank guard Henry Sullivan attempted to draw his weapon during the heist. Thomas's response was swift and merciless. He shot Sullivan in the shoulder with the same emotionless efficiency that witnesses had described in Jesse James' later crimes. It wasn't the act of violence itself that was so disturbing. Bank President Marcus Thompson later testified. It was a complete lack of emotion the boy showed. He shot a man, watched him fall, and then continued with the robbery as if nothing significant had happened. There was no anger, no excitement, no regret, just the cold professionalism of someone who had done this many times before. But what truly convinced observers that something impossible was happening was Thomas's response when Sullivan, bleeding on the bank floor, looked up at him and whispered, "Jesse." Thomas paused in his collection of money from the safe, looked down at the wounded man, and replied, "Hello, Henry. It's been a long time since Northfield." The reference was to the Jesse James gang's disastrous 1876 raid on Northfield, Minnesota, where Henry Sullivan had worked as a bank guard before moving to Missouri. Sullivan had never spoken publicly about his role in that famous battle, and there was no way that a 16-year-old boy born 6 years later could have known about the connection. As 1899 began, Thomas Garrett had become the most wanted criminal in Missouri, with a bounty on his head that exceeded the original price offered for Jesse James. But rather than going into hiding or fleeing to safer territory, Thomas announced his intention to complete what he called Jesse's unfinished business through a series of increasingly audacious crimes that seemed designed to recreate the original outlaw's most famous exploits. The announcement came in the form of a letter delivered to the offices of the Kansas City Star on January 15th, 1899. Written in the same distinctive handwriting that had been found on Jesse James's personal documents, the letter outlined Thomas's plans for the coming year and included specific threats against individuals who had been involved in Jesse's downfall 16 years earlier. To the people of Missouri, the letter began, Jesse Woodson James was murdered by cowards who sold their honor for reward money. The men who conspired in this betrayal have lived 16 years, thinking they were safe from justice. They were wrong. The debt they incurred will be paid in full before this year ends. And Missouri will remember that some crimes cannot be forgiven or forgotten. The letter went on to list specific targets. Robert Ford had been killed in 1892, but his surviving family members were marked for what Thomas called appropriate consequences. Governor David Francis, who had refused to grant Jesse James clemency, was threatened with a justice that political cowardice has delayed too long. Most ominously, several bankers and railroad executives who had profited from the capture of Jesse's gang were warned that their theft of blood money would be repaid with interest. Sheriff Bradley, now coordinating with federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives in the hunt for Thomas, realized that he was no longer dealing with simple criminal activity, but with what amounted to a terrorist campaign designed to settle decades-old grievances. The scope and sophistication of Thomas's plans suggested access to resources and information that went far beyond what a teenage outlaw should possess. The campaign began with the robbery of the Merchants Bank in Sedalia on February 14, 1899, exactly 17 years after Jesse James had robbed the same institution. Thomas executed the crime using identical methods to the original heist down to details about timing, approach routes, and escape plans that had never been made public. The symbolic nature of the date and location sent a clear message that this was about more than money. But the Sedalia robbery also revealed the extent to which Thomas had recruited allies beyond his core gang of outlaws. During the escape, the robbers were aided by townspeople who provided fresh horses, food, and shelter. Despite the risks involved, investigation revealed that Thomas had somehow convinced dozens of law-abiding citizens that he was genuinely Jesse James returned to complete a righteous mission against corrupt authorities. The boy has a way of talking people that makes them believe impossible things. Sheriff Bradley reported to his superiors in Jefferson City, he's not just robbing banks anymore. He's building a movement convincing folks that he's some kind of avenging angel sent to settle old wrongs. We're not just dealing with a criminal gang anymore. We're facing something that could turn into a full-scale uprising if we don't stop it soon. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. By March 1899, over 50 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies have been deployed to Missouri with orders to capture Thomas Garrett, dead or alive. The manhunt was coordinated by Captain William Hayes, a former military officer who had experience dealing with insurgent movements during the Indian Wars. But Thomas seemed to anticipate every move the authorities made, always staying one step ahead of their efforts to trap him. His gang had grown to over 30 members, including several former Confederate soldiers who brought military discipline and tactical expertise to their operations. More troubling, Thomas had begun recruiting from the ranks of active duty law enforcement, convincing deputies and town marshals that their true loyalty should be to Jesse James rather than to the corrupt officials who employed them. The psychological warfare Thomas conducted against his pursuers was as sophisticated as his criminal operations. He would leave messages at crime scenes that contained personal information about individual lawmen, details about their families, their weaknesses, their secret shames that could only have been gathered through extensive intelligence operations. The message was clear. No one hunting him was safe, and no secret was beyond his reach. What made Thomas Garrett's transformation truly unsettling wasn't just his criminal success, but the breadth and depth of knowledge he displayed about events, people, and places that he should never have encountered. As his campaign of terror intensified during 1899, witnesses began documenting examples of his impossible familiarity with Missouri's criminal history that defied rational explanation. During the robbery of the Citizens Bank in Clinton on April 7, 1899, Thomas had addressed elderly customer Margaret Wheeler by name and asked about her late husband's recovery from wounds he had received during a Jesse James robbery in 1874. Mrs. Wheeler had never spoken publicly about her husband's injury, which had been treated privately by a country doctor who had since died. The only way Thomas could have known about the incident was if he had been present when it occurred. Similar incidents occurred throughout 1899, as Thomas encountered people who had connections to the original Jesse James criminal career. He would reference private conversations, describe personal habits of deceased gang members, and demonstrate familiarity with locations and events that had never been documented in newspapers or official records. Frank Wheeler, who had become increasingly disturbed by Thomas's uncanny knowledge, finally confronted the young outlaw about information that only the original Jesse James could have possessed. During a private conversation in May 1899, Wheeler asked Thomas about a cache of stolen money that Jesse had reportedly buried near Excelsior Springs, money that had never been recovered and whose location had died with the outlaw. Thomas's response was immediate and specific. He provided detailed directions to the burial site, described the landmarks that Jesse had used to mark the location, and even mentioned the distinctive metal box that had been used to protect the money from moisture. When Wheeler and two other gang members investigated, they found exactly what Thomas had described: $3,400 in gold and silver coins buried in the precise location he had indicated. There's no way that boy could have known about that money, Wheeler later told authorities. During his eventual surrender, Jesse never told anyone where it was buried, not even Frank James. The only person who could have found it was someone who had buried himself 16 years ago. Even more disturbing were Thomas's accurate predictions about law enforcement activities. He seemed to know in advance which routes patrols would take, which informants were providing information to authorities, and which safe houses had been compromised. During one particularly remarkable incident in June 1899, Thomas warned his gang to avoid a specific area near Independence because the Pinkertons are setting up an ambush there tomorrow morning at dawn. When gang members asked how he could know such specific information about enemy movements, Thomas's response was characteristically enigmatic. I've been running from these same men for over 30 years. I know how they think, how they plan, and how they try to trap people. Like us, some knowledge doesn't die just because the body does. The federal agents hunting Thomas began to suspect that he had access to inside information from sources within law enforcement agencies. But despite extensive investigations, they could never identify any specific individuals who might be providing intelligence to the gang. The alternative explanation that a 19-year-old farm boy possessed supernatural knowledge about criminal activities that had ended before his birth was too impossible for rational men to accept. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. During the robbery of the Farmers' Bank in Butler, on July 23, 1899, Thomas had walked directly to a specific floorboard and removed a hidden compartment containing the bank's emergency cash reserve. Bank president Charles Morrison later testified that the hiding place had been installed 15 years earlier and that knowledge of its existence was limited to himself and one deceased partner who had helped design the security measures. The boy knew exactly where to look, Morrison told investigators with obvious bewilderment. He didn't search or experiment. He walked straight to that board like he had hidden the money there himself. When I asked how he knew about our secret cache, he just smiled and said that Jesse had always been good at finding where people hid their valuables. By the autumn of 1899, Thomas Garrett had accomplished something that law enforcement officials found more threatening than his individual crimes. He had created a network of supporters and collaborators that extended far beyond his immediate gang. Farmers offered shelter and supplies. Merchants provided information about valuable shipments, and even some members of respectable society had begun contributing to what they saw as a righteous campaign against corrupt institutions. The transformation of public opinion was perhaps Thomas's most remarkable achievement. Through carefully crafted public statements and symbolic gestures, he had repositioned himself from a common criminal to a folk hero, continuing Jesse James' battle against economic oppression and political corruption. His robberies targeted banks and railroads that were genuinely unpopular with ordinary citizens, and his treatment of common people during crimes was consistently respectful and even generous. During the robbery of the Missouri Pacific train near Otterville, on September 12, 1899, Thomas ordered his gang to return money and valuables to passengers who appeared to be working-class individuals struggling to make ends meet. Wealthy travelers were relieved of their possessions, but poor farmers and laborers were treated with courtesy and sometimes given small amounts of money from the gang's proceeds. He looked at my callous hands and asked what kind of work I did, recalled passenger William Hoffman, a blacksmith from Jefferson City. When I told him I was traveling to see my sick mother, he handed me $20 and told me to make sure she got proper medical care. Then he apologized for the inconvenience and wished my mother a swift recovery. It was the strangest robbery I could imagine. This carefully cultivated public image made Thomas's capture increasingly difficult. Communities that should have been cooperating with law enforcement instead provided protection and assistance to the gang. Tips about planned raids were leaked to Thomas's supporters. Safe houses were offered by respectable citizens, and a general atmosphere of non-cooperation made the manhunt nearly impossible to conduct effectively. Sheriff Bradley found himself fighting not just a criminal organization, but a popular movement that viewed Thomas as a legitimate heir to Jesse James's legacy. We're not just chasing outlaws anymore, he reported to Governor Francis in October 1899. We're fighting a legend that grows stronger every time we fail to capture him. The boy has convinced half of Missouri that he's some kind of avenging angel, and the other half is too scared to oppose him. The psychological impact of Thomas's campaign extended far beyond Missouri's borders. Newspapers across the nation carried stories about the Jesse James reborn phenomenon, and the case attracted attention from criminologists, psychologists, and even religious leaders who struggled to explain how a teenager could possess such extensive knowledge about historical events and criminal techniques. Dr. Edmund Walsh, a physician specializing in mental disorders, traveled from Chicago to interview witnesses and examine evidence related to Thomas's case. His conclusions, published in the American Journal of Psychological Medicine in December 1899, raised more questions than they answered. The subject displays knowledge and behavioral patterns that cannot be explained through conventional understanding of human psychology, Dr. Walsh wrote, either this individual has access information through unknown means, or we must consider the possibility that human consciousness is capable of phenomena that current scientific knowledge cannot account for. The end of Thomas Garrett's extraordinary criminal career began with an act of betrayal that perfectly mirrored the circumstances surrounding Jesse James's death 16 years earlier. Samuel Hayes, who had been Thomas's most trusted lieutenant since the early days of the gang, began secretly negotiating with federal authorities about the terms of surrender and the substantial reward money that had been offered for Thomas's capture. The betrayal was motivated by more than simple greed. Hayes had become increasingly disturbed by Thomas's behavior during the final months of 1899, particularly his growing willingness to use violence against anyone who questioned his authority or threatened his plans. The young man, who had once shown concern for innocent bystanders, had evolved into someone capable of cold-blooded murder when his objectives required it. He wasn't the same person I had started following, Hayes later explained to authorities. Something had changed in him, something dark and dangerous that made him more like the worst stories about Jesse James, rather than the romantic figure people remembered. He started talking about killing people who had crossed him, about settling scores that went back decades, and I realized that I was following someone who had become genuinely evil. The specific incident that convinced Hayes to betray Thomas occurred during the gang's final robbery conducted at the Bank of Versailles on March 15, 1900. When elderly bank clerk Robertson attempted to trigger an alarm, Thomas shot him without hesitation or apparent emotion. But it was Thomas's behavior after the shooting that truly horrified Hayes and several other gang members. Standing over Chen's dying body, Thomas had looked down with what witnesses described as satisfaction rather than regret and said, "That's what happens to people who don't understand that some debts can only be paid in blood." The casual cruelty of the statement, combined with Thomas's obvious pleasure in violence, convinced Hayes that he was no longer following the same person who had recruited him 3 years earlier. Hayes's negotiations with Captain William Hayes, no relation of the federal marshals, were conducted in absolute secrecy over a period of several weeks. The plan that emerged was designed to minimize casualties while ensuring that Thomas could not escape to continue his criminal career. Most importantly, Hayes insisted that the capture attempt be conducted in a way that would allow Thomas to be taken alive, if possible, partly out of lingering loyalty, and partly because so many questions about his impossible knowledge remained unanswered. The location chosen for the trap was a farmhouse near Liberty, where Thomas had been hiding while planning what he called the job that would make Jesse James immortal forever. Hayes had learned that Thomas intended to rob the Liberty Bank again, this time with the goal of stealing enough money to finance a permanent criminal organization that would continue Jesse's work indefinitely. On April 3, 1900, exactly 18 years after Jesse James's death and Thomas's birth, federal marshals surrounded the farmhouse where Thomas was meeting with his remaining followers. The timing was symbolic rather than coincidental. Hayes had specifically chosen the date because he believed it might have psychological significance for someone who claimed to be Jesse James reincarnated. The siege began at dawn with Captain Hayes calling for Thomas's surrender through a speaking trumpet. The response came in Thomas's voice, but with an edge of desperate fury that witnesses had never heard before. "You want Jesse James? Come and take him, but know that you'll pay the same price that everyone else has paid for betraying me." The final battle between Thomas Garrett and federal law enforcement lasted nearly 6 hours and demonstrated the tactical expertise that had made him so difficult to capture during his 3-year criminal career. Despite being outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded by experienced lawmen, Thomas and his remaining gang members managed to hold their position while inflicting casualties that shocked their pursuers. Thomas's behavior during the siege convinced even skeptical observers that something extraordinary was taking place. Rather than the panicked desperation typical of cornered criminals, he displayed the calm professionalism of someone who had faced similar situations many times before. His commands to his followers were precise and effective. His use of available cover was masterful, and his tactical decisions consistently outmaneuvered opponents with superior training and equipment. The boy fought like someone who had been in battles before, Captain Hayes reported in his official account of the siege. Not like a teenager who had learned about gunfighting from dime novels, but like a veteran who knew exactly how to use terrain, timing, and psychology to maximum advantage. "If I hadn't known better, I would have sworn I was fighting someone with decades of military experience." More unsettling were the personal comments Thomas shouted at individual lawmen during breaks in the fighting. He seemed to know details about their backgrounds, their families, and their previous cases that he should never have been able to learn. Several officers reported that Thomas addressed them by name despite never having met them before, and that he made references to their past activities that suggested extensive intelligence gathering or impossible access to confidential information. As the siege continued through the afternoon, Thomas's ammunition and options began to run low. One by one, his remaining followers were killed or wounded until only Thomas himself remained alive inside the farmhouse. But rather than surrendering or attempting a desperate escape, he began shouting statements that would be remembered and debated for decades to come. You think killing this body will end what Jesse James started? His voice carried, clearly across the farmyard to the assembled lawmen. You're wrong. You killed me once before, and look how that turned out. Death is just another kind of prison, and I've already proven that some prisoners can't be held forever. The final assault on the farmhouse was led by Captain Hayes personally, who had become convinced that Thomas represented a threat that went beyond conventional criminal activity. As federal marshals closed in from multiple directions, Thomas made his last stand in the building's main room, fighting with skills that seemed impossible for someone his age. The end came suddenly and violently. Cornered and out of ammunition, Thomas drew a revolver and began firing with accuracy that allowed him to wound 2 more officers before. Captain Hayes managed to get close enough for a killing shot. But even in death, Thomas Garrett managed to deliver one final chilling message. As he lay dying on the farmhouse floor, blood spreading from the wounds that would end his extraordinary life, Thomas looked directly at Captain Hayes and spoke his final words with perfect clarity. This isn't over. Jesse James doesn't stay dead, and the people who killed him don't get to live in peace. Remember that when you're trying to sleep at night. He died at exactly 6:47 p.m. on April 3rd, 1900, 18 years to the day after Jesse James had been shot by Robert Ford. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental, but no one could explain how Thomas had managed to orchestrate his death to match such symbolically significant circumstances. Just when we thought the story of Thomas Garrett had ended with his death, the aftermath would reveal evidence that would disturb investigators for years to come and create a legend that Clay County residents still discuss more than 2 decades later. Share this video with someone who appreciates the darkest chapters of American history. Hit that like button if this tale has kept you on the edge of your seat, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of identity and death. What authorities found when they searched Thomas's belongings would raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. Questions about how a farm boy from Missouri could have possessed knowledge that died with America's most notorious outlaw 18 years before Thomas was even born. The search of Thomas Garrett's personal effects following his death revealed a collection of items that federal investigators initially assumed must be forgeries or reproductions, created to support his Jesse James impersonation. However, detailed examination by handwriting experts, historians, and even former associates of the original Jesse James confirmed that many of these artifacts were genuine objects that had belonged to the real outlaw and had been missing since his death in 1882. The most significant discovery was a leather saddlebag containing Jesse James's personal journal written in a distinctive handwriting that had been verified through comparison with known samples from wanted posters and court documents. The journal entries dated from 1881 and early 1882, covering the final months of Jesse's life, and contained information about crimes, hideouts, and future plans that had never been made public. But what made the journal truly disturbing was the presence of additional entries written in the same handwriting, but clearly dated from the 1890s, years after Jesse James was supposed to have died. These later entries described events from Thomas Garrett's criminal career with the same voice and perspective as the earlier material, as if the same person had simply resumed writing after an 18-year interruption. The handwriting analysis is conclusive, reported Professor Marcus Sullivan from the University of Missouri, who'd been consulted as an expert in document authentication. Dr. Edmund Walsh, who had studied the case extensively, published a follow-up analysis in 1901 that outlined the fundamental questions raised by Thomas's criminal career. We are confronted with an individual who demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for him to possess, abilities that should have required decades to develop, and a personality transformation that defied accepted understanding of human psychology. Walsh wrote, whether we explain this through unknown natural phenomena or acknowledge the possibility of supernatural intervention, we must admit that our current knowledge is insufficient to provide satisfactory answers. The impact on Clay County itself was profound and lasting. Many residents became convinced that Thomas had genuinely been Jesse James returned from the dead, while others maintained that the whole affair was an elaborate hoax that had gotten out of hand. Families were divided by disagreements about what they had witnessed, and the community struggled to return to normal life after 3 years of living with what amounted to a reincarnated legend. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas's case inspired dozens of similar claims throughout the Midwest. Young men began appearing in various communities, claiming to be reincarnated outlaws or historical figures, and demonstrating knowledge that seemed impossible for them to possess. While most of these cases were eventually exposed as fraudulent, a few exhibited characteristics that investigators found genuinely disturbing. More than 2 decades have passed since Thomas Garrett's death in that Liberty farmhouse, but the questions raised by his extraordinary transformation remain unanswered. The official records have been sealed by federal authorities, supposedly to protect the privacy of families involved, but rumors persist that evidence exists which could never be made public without causing widespread panic about the nature of death and human consciousness. Local residents who witnessed Thomas's criminal career remain divided about what they actually saw. Some maintain that he was simply a remarkably intelligent and charismatic young man who had somehow gained access to secret information about Jesse James' activities. Others insist that no natural explanation could account for the depth and accuracy of his knowledge or for the psychological transformation that turned a quiet farm boy into a criminal mastermind. "I knew that boy from the time he was born until the day he died," recalled Martha Hopkins, who had been Thomas's teacher during his early years. "What I saw during those final 3 years wasn't the same person I had taught to read and write. Something had changed in him, something fundamental that went beyond simple criminal behavior or role-playing, whether you want to call it possession, reincarnation, or something else. Entirely, it wasn't natural. The physical evidence that convinced so many observers has largely disappeared. Jesse James' personal effects that were found among Thomas's possessions were confiscated by federal authorities and have never been displayed publicly. The journal containing entries from both Jesse's lifetime and Thomas's criminal career was classified as evidence in an ongoing investigation and removed from public access. Even photographs of Thomas during his outlaw years were collected and suppressed officially to prevent copycat criminals from using his image for their own purposes. But stories persist about people who knew Thomas during his transformation, who witnessed his impossible knowledge and uncanny abilities, and who remained convinced that they experienced something that defied rational explanation. These accounts passed down through families and shared in whispered conversations have created a legend that continues to grow despite official efforts to minimize its significance. The question that haunts Clay County to this day is whether Thomas Garrett was simply an exceptional criminal who managed to access lost historical information, or whether his case represents evidence of phenomena that current understanding cannot explain. Did Jesse James somehow return from the dead to complete his criminal career through the body of a farm boy born at the moment of his death? Or was Thomas simply a disturbed young man who managed to convince himself and others that he was someone he could never actually become? The truth may never be known with certainty. The official records remain sealed. The physical evidence has been removed from public access, and most of the witnesses to Thomas's transformation have taken their stories to their graves. But the legend of the farm boy who became Jesse James continues to circulate through Missouri, growing more elaborate with each telling and inspiring new generations of people who want to believe that death is not the end of human ambition and that some individuals are too powerful to be contained by mortality. What do you think about this extraordinary tale from America's criminal past? Could Thomas Garrett really have been Jesse James reincarnated, returned to complete the mission that was interrupted by an assassin's bullet in 1882? Or was this simply an elaborate case of mistaken identity and wishful thinking that created a legend more powerful than the truth it was built upon? The evidence points in multiple directions, and perhaps that ambiguity is what makes the story so compelling and so disturbing. This mystery shows us that the line between history and legend is often thinner than we might expect, and that some questions about human nature and the boundaries of death may never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. Whether Thomas Garrett was a criminal genius, a deluded young man, or something far more extraordinary, his story forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the power of belief to shape reality. If you found this tale as fascinating as it is unsettling, share this video with someone who appreciates the darkest mysteries from American history. Hit that like button to support our exploration of cases that challenge everything we think we know about life and death, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories that blur the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Thomas Garrett was really Jesse James reborn? Or was this simply one of history's most elaborate cases of mistaken identity? Until next time, remember that some legends refuse to stay buried, and that the most disturbing stories are often those that might actually be true